Hello and welcome to the Fundamentals of Lute Playing. My name is Laudon Schuett, and today we're going to be talking about lute maintenance. Now, I've put off making this video for some time because I do not consider myself the best caretaker of instruments. I'll be completely honest. I am a little bit brutal because of traveling, because of performing, and all of that stuff. I have always just kind of worked out my own ways to do things. Well, I'll give you a really good example. Some years back, in the middle of a rehearsal, one of my wooden frets, one of the frets actually on the sound body that are not tied around, popped up in the middle of the rehearsal. And I remember, my friend there was like, oh, well, you could just get some wood glue and you press it down and you hold it there and then it'll, stay in place and you keep it there. And if it comes up again, you do it again, it'll be just fine. Or take it to a luthier if you're really uncomfortable. My solution was to go get some clear tape. I slapped the clear tape right onto that fret and continued on with the rehearsal. And I've never taken it off. I've never taken it to a luthier since because it's such a pain to go find a luthier and to travel and take the instrument. And I have to admit, I went and bought the wood glue and just never bothered to do it. So I would consider this sort of the caretaking of instruments to be a weakness of mine. And because of that, I put off making this video. The solution that I came up with, because I do think that it's really important, is that I am going to include lots of links in the description for specific things, how to care. I'm including, for example, I'm including a video of somebody dutifully changing strings and just doing a beautiful job with all of that and peg dope and making sure everything is really nice. That way you can see it done that way. And what I will do is I'll go through that as well. But I'm also going to maybe share some tricks I've learned for performing, for unusual situations, how to deal with problems that arise, because I think, I've managed to kind of get the instrument to work and do what I need it to do under lots of different circumstances. And I've got a little list here. That way I wouldn't forget anything. And I think if you're absolutely new to taking care of an instrument, there'll be some very helpful things here. And then for the more advanced players, like I said, there'll be maybe some tricks you haven't run along with. But the first thing is when you get your lute, I think it's really, really important to have a place for it that is safe. And this is even more true if you are someone who travels to perform, or even just you're an amateur and you don't perform, but you want to bring your lute with you on vacation. One of the issues with the lute is that I think most of us have, this is a Kingham case, and I'll put a link to Kingham in the description. They've been kind of the #1 lute case maker for a very long time. My teacher Paul O'Dad, I think almost all of his cases are from Kingham. And they're fine cases, but I wouldn't trust them underneath an airplane, and it always terrified me to put my lute in and go that. So I will say I'm still hoping that there's a good carbon fiber company out there. I've heard some rumors that maybe Le Lute sells cases that fit, so I'm looking into that. I admittedly at this point I just buy a second seat on the airplane for it. I buckle it in and then I take it. Or if it's a drivable distance, I bring it in the car. It is very, very nerve-wracking putting an instrument underneath the airplane. Now, in terms of when to put the instrument in the case, I do know some people who have rooms specifically for their instruments. Maybe it's a humidified room or they've got special racks. And I'm not going to be talking about you guys. In general, it seems to be how to make the instrument stay safe. But for those of you who are not experts in taking care of instruments, I'd say that most of the time your instrument should be in the case. I know it might be tempting. It's a beautiful instrument. People like to hang their instruments on the wall and things like that. But as a father of a toddler, things happen. We've had big storms that rattle the walls. My toddler has thrown things. I've lived in places where, an earthquake could occur or something, and then the instrument falls and it breaks. It's just so much safer in its case. And that sort of leads me to the other situation, which is humidity. There are people that go to great lengths to make sure that their instrument is at optimal 50%, between 50 and 60% humidity. They've got setups in the rooms to keep their instrument safe. And I have so much respect for those people. My mentality has always been one of a little bit of natural selection. Like my instruments, because they need to travel, because they need to I did one concert in New Hampshire, and then a few days later I was down in like South Carolina. So I went from very little humidity on the in the north, inwards on the coast, and then down in like Charleston where it was just wet. Everything was wet, and my poor lute was just pulling it out to practice. It was soaking it up. So I need an instrument that can survive that. And so I've been very lucky. This one has done quite well. And that is why I've worked with it. And when I look for another instrument, I'm hopefully going to get a 7 or 8 course someday soon. I'll be looking for that same quality. I need something that's a little bit tougher. For me, the simplest thing, and like I said, I'll include a link. In terms of humidity, grab it. D'Addario started making these humidipacks, which basically take the thinking out of it, which was quite nice for somebody like me. When I was a classical guitar player, I used to have the little sponges with water and a little meter to keep track of everything. What this basically does is it adds humidity if it's needed, and it takes humidity out, soaks it up if there's too much. And it keeps it right about in the between 50 and 60%, if I'm remembering correctly. And they are technically designed for guitars, but what I do is I just pop one of these, and you can see there are these little packets with like a gel on the inside that go in there. You can even see it's got the little guitar there. So for the guitar, you would dangle one in between the strings, and one's at the headstock. For the lute, I just toss 1 or 2 into the headstock, depending on the size of the instrument. And the system is very simple. You replace it when it dries up, which is really nice for me. And being where I am now with all the humidity, it's a wonderful, wonderful tool. So if you're somebody who does not like to fuss around with room humidifiers and refilling sponges and doing things like that, the humidipack system is really, really good and very practical. And I think that's what I'll say about humidity, because it's worked so well. So if you've had trouble, try that out. Otherwise, seek elsewhere. Again, I am the sort of natural selection guy with instruments. I just let the instrument deal with the weather, and hopefully it's fine. And if it needs to be repaired, it gets repaired. People often have a lot of questions about strings. Now, there is a company in Italy, Acqualacorde, which was founded by Mimo Perufo, and it is a phenomenal, phenomenal company, particularly if you are interested in using synthetic strings or non-gut strings. And I think I've talked about this a little bit in previous episodes. I don't have anything against gut. There are just 2 things that I would keep in mind. Number one, if you're like me and you don't have a lot of spare money, they're expensive. They tend to be, especially good gut tends to be expensive. There are ways you can keep it alive longer and it can last longer, but I just find that, especially getting out of grad school some years back and just trying to survive, paying for new strings was just very burdensome. The second thing I will say is that the way they made gut in the 16th century, there are still some things we don't quite understand, and then there are some things that are dangerous that we can't really do anymore. We know, for example, that they would load strings with mercury and arsenic, and that would allow a thinner string to essentially be used for the basses and things like that. Mimo Perufo has gone to great lengths to this. He's just a genius, and I absolutely love watching his videos and reading his discussions on researching into this. And this is not an attack on gut, but there is a perception that, oh, I play with gut strings, this is historically accurate. And I would just add a little nuance to that and say, well, the gut strings we're making today, I think we're getting closer, and I think we're finding ways to sort of unlock those secrets. But last I checked, we really hadn't completely got it figured out. I think gut strings are beautiful. I've played with them. I enjoy hearing other players use it, but I wouldn't necessarily use it as a sort of thing to make other people feel guilty about, like, oh, I use gut strings and that's the, these are the historically accurate strings that sound like they did in the 16th century. Well, not quite. There are a lot of things we're still working out in terms of gut manufacturing. And I would say, if you check out Aquila Cordae and you read up on what Mimo has to say about his synthetic strings, Mimo has done a lot to go and research how original gut strings were made, as much as anybody I've heard. He's done a tremendous amount of work. And then what he's done is he's gone and found ways to sort of create a synthetic version of that. So one example are these new Aquila Reds that came out a few years, these bass strings that are red. They just are absolutely fantastic. And I refuse to use anything else now in the sort of synthetic line of strings, because they feel great, they fit really well on the instrument, they're not wound, they get a great sound, they don't ring out too long, so you don't have to worry about cleaning out bass notes just as much. So I will put the link to Aquila Cordae up there, and then also some gut options. I mean, most of these, I think Aquila offers some gut, and then I'll put Gamut and Boston Cat lines for those of you living in the United States. And what I recommend is that when you get your instrument, it's really helpful to reach out to someone. For me, living in the U.S., Boston Cat Lines with Chris Olav Henriksen is the person that I reach out to. I email him directly, and I literally say, okay, I've got an instrument. It's 60.5 centimeters sounding length, string length. I need to tune it at 8440. I'd like the tension to be moderate, and I need this type of string. And he'll work with me. He's wonderful, and figure out, okay, what's going to be the best thing for that. Because there is so much variety with lutes, and there's such a big difference with the strings, communicating with your string provider, I think, is really important. So if you're in the US, I recommend Boston Cat Lines, and I'll put a link in the description for that. And then if you're somewhere else, you might want to find your Aquila provider, or you could order directly from Aquila, and that's absolutely fine as well. In terms of changing strings, if you're a classical guitarist and you've changed strings, not much different on the bridge end. The winding can be a little tricky sometimes. I found an absolutely wonderful video with a great view by Daniel Keene changing strings. And I was like, okay, I'm just going to provide a link to that. And, he sets the lute on the table. He's got, it must be like a camera on his forehead, way beyond my technological ability. And he just very clearly shows all of the knots at both ends, dutifully using the peg dough. It's a beautiful video. So if you're struggling with changing strings, that video will be in the description for you to watch. I didn't really want to reinvent the wheel. One trick, though. One thing that I have noticed is that a lot of the videos out there of changing lute strings show somebody putting the lute on the table, which is wonderful. Sometimes they even have a neck rest and everything is just perfectly set up, and then they flip the lute over to do things. I've had strings break on stage, literally, on stage or 5 minutes before a concert, and I have to change it. There's no table, there's no beautiful thing like that. So one trick that I do is I take the body of the instrument and I pop it into the lute case, and then I rest the head on my leg. And then from there, I'm able to grab my handy string bag, which I think everybody should have. And I'll talk a little bit more about what you should have in here and some ways to sort of prepare for disaster. But let's say I have a string break, open my handy bag, I've got some loose strings in here, I pull out a string, and then suddenly I've got the instrument right here. I can tie at that end, I can tie at this end, and then I can get those string changed in a Niffy. If you don't have your case on stage and you don't want to go back and get your case and you're literally out there, and I've had situations like this, you can put the lute between your legs like this. You tie one end, tie this end, and then remember when you're winding, it's always toward the top of the instrument, so you're winding this way, like that. So that's just a couple little tricks. Now, in terms of your bag that you have here, and then we're going to talk about frets. Some things that I find really useful: nail clippers to cut away old strings, especially toenail clippers are very helpful. Fingernail clippers tend to be a little too weak, and they don't get through those bass strings very well. So getting a nice big toenail clipper can be very, very helpful. And then obviously I keep strings, and one thing that I'll do so that I can find them very quickly is I will label and combine sets. So for example, I've got a bunch of third courses right here. It's a little messy right now because I recently had to go in diving in and grabbing stuff. Here's first course right there. But before a performance, what I'll do is I'll sort of put it all in order so I can find it very, very quickly. The other thing that I do, and this was something I'd learned from a violin friend, is it can be really, really helpful to put a set of strings on your instrument, play with that set of strings, get it nice and worn in at exactly where you want it to be. And this is particularly helpful for performers. You get all those strings worn in and feeling good, and then you take them off, you curl them back up, and you put them in a packet in the instrument case or in a bag like that. And that way, if a string breaks on stage, you can pull a string from that set that has already been trained to your instrument. So there's a funny thing that happens when you put a new string on the instrument. For at least a couple of days, you're going to get it's going to go down in pitch. It's going to loosen up, and you're going to have to bring it up. And it's just the string stretching. But once you have the string stable, and it's been stable for a couple of days, even if you take it off the instrument and then you put it back on, some of that stretch will be retained. And so it will take less time for the string to stay in tune. So having an already used set of strings available, especially for performers, is really, really helpful. And I will have like actually 3 for the highest string, the chanterelle, because that kind of is the most likely one to break. So beyond that for strings, is there anything else I wanted to say in terms of strings? Not a whole lot. Frets. Some interesting problems arise with frets, and I'm going to put in the link several videos. There'll be a very nice video showing gut frets. There'll be a very nice video showing changing the new synthetic fret guts, and then I'll talk a little bit about nylon frets. So we sort of have those as options, and there are advantages and disadvantages to each. So for example, for real gut, which I think I just removed the very last of my real gut frets. One thing I love about real gut frets is that they go around the edge very nicely, and then they crease so that there's no air between the fret and the fingerboard. Which can cause some issues if it's slightly raised. It can change the tone. It can be difficult to get a nice clean sound. So that is really, really, really nice. And actual gut, one of the things that I've noticed is it's the easiest to spin. And what do I mean by that? Well, when you play for a while, what happens is you push into that fret and it starts to make a little groove. And if that little groove gets deep enough, it'll start to buzz because the string is now low enough that it is touching the next fret up. And one of the nice things about animal gut frets is that you can literally just spin the fret around to a new portion, and it generally stays pretty well. What I usually do is I push the fret back like this, and then I'll spin it, and then I'll move it back up. I don't really want to do that with these because they're synthetic, and one of the disadvantages to the synthetic ones is they don't do that very well. They tend to be shaped to wherever you first put them. The animal gut frets, yeah, they tend to wear out a little faster, but like I said, you can spin them, which is really, really nice. And at least as of a few years ago, they were a little more expensive. So that's the disadvantages, but I do love the fact that you can spin those when they start to wear out. It's just fantastic. Aqua Acorde actually has a fairly new, I don't know, last 5 or so years, they started putting out a synthetic fret gut line. So if you don't like using animal gut, I know some people it's a moral thing, and that's absolutely fine. If you're fed up with it wearing out or you've had some issues, sometimes animal gut does not do as well traveling. So you can try out the synthetic gut strings, and these are really nice. You basically tie them. They have a special way to tie, and I'm including a video actually of Mimo. I'm going to put that in the description, showing you how to tie the synthetic fret gut. And what I have found is the price is good. They stick around for a good amount of time, and they're very stable when you travel, which is great. Disadvantages is once you get that groove in there from playing, I haven't found a really good way to spin it and kind of keep it fresh. There is an emergency way of doing it, which is that if you spin it and it's a little loose, you can take a piece of paper, actually like this, and you could tuck it under the fret to tighten it. And that can be sort of a temporary solution, but it eventually will wear out, and you'll just need to put new synthetic on. Now, that said, it's so cheap, I don't hesitate. I just change the frets when I need to, which is really nice. So I've got a video from Mimo to link to that in the description for you to check out. Now, the last one is nylon. And my first nice lute, I had it arrived with nylon frets on. And I remember talking to Paul Odette about it. And I said, do I need to change these? And he goes, they're already on there, and you're probably never going to have to change them. And he was almost right. It was like 10 years before one of them wore out, and I was like, oh, I'll change all of them. And it was a huge mess because the diameters were incorrect and all of that. So there are nylon frets, and they will absolutely, if you can get them on and shape them well, they will last forever. They just ages. Now, there are some disadvantages. I find that nylon you have to really tighten them. And what I noticed when they came off of that lute after 10 years, they'd actually put grooves into the fingerboard. And all frets will do that a little bit, but this was much more significant. So that's something to be aware of, as the nylon seems to be a little rougher on the fingerboard. The other thing is that when you're working with the nylon, you definitely want to use the thinnest fret possible. And we'll talk a little bit about picking fret diameters and how that works. But essentially, what can happen is the nylon, when it goes around the edge of the fingerboard, it doesn't crease well. So you can get a little air pocket right at the edge. And like I said, that can be very problematic. It can even cause the fret to be a little higher in that one spot, so that your chanterelle ends up being completely unplayable. It buzzes. So using the thinnest possible nylon to wrap around, and then you want it nice and tight, again, to avoid that air coming through. So those are the 3 main types of frets you'll run into. And I said I'll include tying instructions for gut. Travis Carey, a wonderful luthier, has a video for gut. And then for synthetic, I'm going to include the video of Mimo doing it himself, so you can see how the master does it. My knots, to be honest, I just do a couple square knots, 2 in one direction and 1 in the other. And then I cut it and that's it. With gut, you can burn it off or burn a little nub at the end, and you'll see that with Travis's video, which is a fine video with good camera work where you can see everything very, very clearly. In terms of the diameters, now the easiest thing is if you purchase a lute and everything is working, I would either ask the luthier that you got the instrument from or the person that you bought it for those fret diameters. So is it 1 millimeter, 0.9, 0.95, 0.75? That way you just have a list and you can order it. And it's just easy. I had a situation where I was fairly young and I made the mistake of cutting some frets off and not knowing their diameters. I just thought I could do the sort of normal thing, 1, 0.95, 0.9, and it ended up being a huge mess. I had buzzes and all of that. It took me forever to figure out what the diameters were. So getting those original diameters is really, really helpful. There are different views. Some people like to do, thickest fret here. They'll do something like 1 millimeter and then 0.95, 0.9, 0.85, 0.8, 0.75, But I actually, I went and had Andy Rutherford up in Albany, a great luthier who I really love his instruments. He was doing some work on my lute, repairing a bar, and I was asking him about frets, and he said, well, you can basically use the same size fret until it stops working. He goes, well, I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, okay, you could put, so I'll use my instrument as an example. So you could put 0.7 here, check to make sure it works. Do 0.7 here, check to make sure it works. 0.7, 0.7, 0.7. And when it stops working, you just go down a size smaller. And I went, oh, I guess that makes sense with the slope and everything that's going on. So that's another possibility. And what I mean by make sure it's working is I put the fret on and I play each of the notes on that fret and then the fret behind it. And I'll do this as I go. I'll just do every single one, making sure it's nice and clear and that we don't end up with any buzzing. And if you do have buzzing, what you want to do is remove the farthest fret up and go a 0.05 millimeters down and try a smaller fret. Because what's happening is the fret behind it is not lifting the string high enough to clear that next fret. So what we want to do is make sure that we're using one large enough to do that. Or the next one is small enough that it clears. So something to keep in mind, you can either do the descending by 0.05 millimeters, or you can use the smallest. Now in terms of the thickness of frets, they're kind of, the general thought is that the thicker a fret is, the easier it is to play. You don't have to push down as hard. I'm going to be completely honest. I don't know enough about the physics to know whether that's actually true or not. And I haven't had anybody really show me that that's true. But that is something that's said, and it's said by people that I respect. And I have no reason to disbelieve. So that's something to keep in mind, to use the largest possible fret that's available. Again, coming from a sort of low-income background, I kind of went the opposite. I have very small frets. I can actually go probably 10 millimeters or something like that, higher than where I'm at, but thinner is cheaper. And I haven't found that it's any harder to play, or not even significantly harder to play, or anything like that. So that's just my personal experiences. I haven't found that to be true for myself, but I don't know if there's if it's just a small difference and I'm not noticing it. So I don't want to discount what a number of people who I respect have to say. So the general consensus is that using the thickest possible fret that does not cause buzzing is the best. It's going to be the easiest to play. But if you're a cheapo like me, you can go smaller, and I haven't really noticed a significant difference. Okay, so I'll include those videos. Some things to keep in mind for your tuning pegs. Sometimes these swell and they get really, really hard to turn. And what I would say is you want to be very, very careful because they're not the hardest thing in the world to break. And when you break them, it can be a little bit of a pain to go get fixed. But I'll give you a tip on doing that. And in fact, actually, I'll just say that because there are so many instruments that have tuning pegs, you can temporarily get a new peg from a violin shop or an oud shop. You just go in, you take your lute, you have them measure your other pegs, and they'll give you one. It won't match your other ones, but they'll pop it in and you'll at least be able to play. And then if you want to go get a nice lute tuning peg, you can contact a luthier. But I do like to remind people, if they have a problem with a peg, you can go to a violin shop, go to a string shop, and they work with pegs all the time. They can get you a new one and it'll be absolutely fine. So if it does get stuck, what you want to do is understand, first of all, it's the humidity. Almost certainly what's happened is water has gotten into the peg and it's swollen that wood up a little bit. So what I have done in the past, if you have time, is I sort of dehumidify the area by turning up the AC. So I'll turn up the air conditioning unit and dry the air out a little bit. And then I very carefully and very gently loosen it, and very slowly. If you need to use a pair of pliers or something like that, you can. Just make sure that you've really got a grip on the thickest part of it so that you don't accidentally break it. And I just tease it very slowly with tiny little turns. And once you get that peg off, the question is, what do you do then? And one of the tricks that I learned from Paul and from others was you just take some chalk, like school chalk, and you rub it all over the peg. Get it covered in chalk, and then you slip it back in, and that usually loosens it up just enough. Now, it doesn't necessarily solve the root problem, which is the humidity. So again, having a good humidity system, keeping that swelling under control is really important. So getting the D'Addario humidity pack is very, very helpful for that. Now, if you're having the opposite problem and the pegs are really loose, and no matter how far you push them in, and we don't want to push them too far because then they could get stuck, they're not sticking, then you can use what violinists and cellists use all the time, which is peg dope. There are things like Hill's Peg Compound. I'll put a link in the description. Like I said, there's going to be a million links in this video. That's a good one. You just, again, you put it all over. You get the tuning peg out, and you put the peg dope all around the peg, and then you slide it back in, and that'll help to tighten things up, which is really nice. So one other thing I'm going to include, I put this in the original sort of introductory video to the Fundamentals of Lute Playing, which is a link to the Lute Society of America's beginner handout. My good friend and colleague, Warner Ivarus, wrote this some years back for the LSA, and one of the things that I always loved about Warner was he was just super detail oriented, and he does a great job of putting in writing just everything somebody could think of. So I'm going to include a link with that, and he's got some beautiful pictures of how to put the strings into the pegs, and like I said, there will also be the string changing video with Daniel Keene. Let's see, things people run into: rattles, buzzes, and hums, which is the name of an article on the Lute Society, the English Lute Society, and I'm going to include a link to that. Sometimes lutes just end up making all sorts of weird sounds. You play a note, and you'll get a weird buzz or a weird hum. And there are all sorts of reasons for this, dozens and dozens. Sometimes it's a string rubbing against another. Sometimes it's a loose bar on the inside of the instrument. Sometimes it's one of these little wooden frets has come up and it's vibrating on the wood. There are like a bajillion reasons this instrument can make a little sound, and you could drive yourself crazy working it out. She wrote a very nice article to sort of go down the list. And most of them are, you can sort of solve yourself. The most common reason I've had buzzing is, especially with wound bass strings, if I have a wound bass string that's touching, let's say it got stuck in with another string, and when I hit that string, it causes it to vibrate. I've had less of that with the Aquila Reds, which is really nice. Other things, frets getting worn out or frets moving can cause buzzing. You know, if you have a fret that got shifted when it was in the case, that can absolutely cause some buzzing. Like I said, having a loose wooden fret up here. There's all sorts of things. So there's a handy dandy list for that. At some point, if you try everything else out and you can't figure out, then it's probably time to go to a luthier and just see if there's something structural like a loose bar. Or something going on with the, you know, there could be warping of the neck, other things. One other place to check for buzzing, which I found is very common, is people will put their strings on and they won't cut this end short enough. So there'll be a piece of string actually touching the soundboard. And when that happens, that can vibrate as well. So that's a very, very common issue there. Things that you can do to just keep an eye on your instrument. To make sure everything's going well. One thing, at least once a week, what I do is I will look at my bridge. So I'll get a kind of view like this. What can happen is the glue underneath the bridge can start to weaken and the bridge will start to lift. It's a very, very common thing, especially when traveling, that the bridge will pop off. You'll see all sorts of scary pictures on Facebook and on Lute sites of, you know, people on airplanes and their bridge has blown off and things like that. So that glue can weaken over time. And if you can catch the bridge rising just a little bit, then you can loosen the strings and run to a luthier and they'll re-glue that down. If you don't have it's best to go to a luthier or to communicate with a luthier and have them talk to a classical guitar luthier. If you can put them in communication with each other, that's one solution. Classical guitar luthiers change bridges all the time. There's some slight differences though. So if you can get your local classical guitar luthier to talk to a luthier, somebody like Andy Rutherford or Travis Carey, they may be able to talk that guitarist, the guitar luthier, into doing it properly. That way you don't have to ship the instrument. That way you don't have to travel, because I know it's very, very hard to find luthiers. The other thing I'll check once a week is I'll actually go around and I'll just make sure that the soundboard is not peeling off. Because again, it's being held down by glue. And we want to just make sure that everything's still touching. And if you start to see that come up, again, it's an easy repair for a luthier. That's one that I would definitely take the instrument to a luthier. You might be able, maybe an oud luthier would also work, especially if they were communicating with the luthier. But the only times I've ever had the instrument, the top taken off, as it were, it was by a luthier. I have a friend who's very brave, and she has steamed the top and pulled it off. I mean, she was in communication with a luthier the whole time, but boy, that makes me very, very, very nervous. So I think that's almost everything. What I would say is if you hear anything rattling in here when you touch the top like this, or there's some weird humming sound, it could be a loose bar. The bars are kind of what hold the interior of the instrument together. That generally I would say go to a luthier. Like I said, I have a friend who was brave enough to take the top off her lute and get in there. That is way beyond what I'm willing to do. For me, it's changing strings, changing frets. I've done a little bit of peg work. If you are, you'll see in some of the instructions, for example, if the strings aren't gliding over the nut very well, you can take a pencil and put some graphite in those grooves and that could smooth it up. That's kind of the limit of my comfort. I'll admit that when something is really wrong, I run right to the luthier and I just go, oh, fix this for me. So I hope that you find all the links in the description very useful. Like I said, this will be a link-heavy episode. I don't consider myself to be a very good maintainer of instruments. I love my lute, but it's sort of a tool, and I just do what I need to get it working and I get going. I have my own sort of idiosyncratic ways of handling situations on the road. And what I want to make sure is that you have access to maybe the more careful and thoughtful version of instrument maintenance. So that's why there'll be tons and tons of links in the description. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. I'm always happy to hear those. If you're having some issues with your instrument, go ahead and send those to me. It is really unfortunate because as much as I love doing this video series, one of the things that I really enjoy when doing in-person lessons is we have a sort of lute or guitar maintenance day where I have the students sit down and change the strings in front of me or change a fret in front of me. And I think that's really the best way to do it, is to just get in there and do that. And that's very hard to recreate with a video. So I think we'll just do our best. And the whole point of this series is to sort of fill in some gaps, and hopefully if there's anything missing from this video, you pop it in the comments and I can lead you to something to help out. Or maybe you have a unique problem I've never seen and I'll send you to a luthier. But yes, don't be shy. Put some comments in there. Any questions you have, I'll be happy to try to answer those. If you're enjoying the channel so far, the best way you can support it is by subscribing. And I'm also putting my link to Patreon on there if you'd like to support in that way. It's always appreciated. Happy and healthy luting. I hope your instruments are all doing well, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.